The gate hadn't opened yet. The floodlights were still on, throwing a flat white glare across the wet gravel, and under the floodlights, before the sky had color, Bishop was already lying in the exact same spot he'd claimed every morning for the last 5 months. No handler had put him there. No order told him to. The kennel logs had no entry for it, because nobody had trained him to wait. He simply came, every dawn, before the sun cleared the tree line, and folded himself down beside the eastern watchpost, as if he had somewhere to be, and had arrived early out of habit. 5 months. 152 mornings, not one of them missed. Selene Quade did not know any of this when she pulled her car into the visitor lot that Tuesday. She knew only that the folder on her passenger seat held the last of the paperwork, that she had rehearsed the drive so many times in her head that the real one felt second-hand, and that she wanted to be in and out of this base before anyone asked her how she was doing. She had a rule about that question now. She didn't answer it. She changed the subject, or she looked at her phone, or she simply left the room. Her phone buzzed once as she stepped out of the car, a message from the hospital about a shift swap, ordinary, unremarkable. She looked at the screen long enough to register the words, then let it go dark in her palm without replying. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing a person does 100 times a day without noticing they've done it. Her fingers tightened around the phone before she knew why. She put the phone in her coat pocket and walked toward the gate. The guard on duty barely glanced at her ID before waving her through, already half turned back toward the warmth of the guardhouse. Selene tightened her scarf against the cold and started up the gravel path that cut past the kennel yard, the route the woman at reception had described to her over the phone. Straight ahead, second building on the left, ask for Sergeant Naylor. She didn't get 10 steps before something in the shape of the morning changed. A shepherd-built dog, tan and black, graying heavily at the muzzle, lay stretched across the exact width of the path, close enough to the low fence that there was no way around him without stepping into the frost-stiff grass. He didn't lift his head when she approached. He didn't so much as lift his head. His eyes stayed fixed on the gate behind her, patient, unblinking, the posture of something keeping time rather than watching a person. Selene stopped a few feet away and waited for him to move. He didn't. She took a half step to the left, meaning to walk around him through the grass, and for one strange moment his gaze followed her, not with alarm, not with recognition, just with the quiet attention of a sentry noting a shift change. Then his eyes returned to the gate. "Okay," she said under her breath, to no one, and stepped around him properly this time, boots crunching in the frozen grass, folder clutched a little tighter against her chest than it had been a minute ago. She didn't look back until she reached the office door. When she did, he was still there, exactly where he had been, head raised now, eyes tracking her across the yard, the way they had tracked the gate a moment before, as if she too were simply part of the post he was assigned to watch. She told herself it meant nothing. Old base dog, she thought, probably fed by whoever walked by first. She pulled open the office door, and the warmth and the smell of coffee closed around her, and she did not think about the dog again. Not yet. Behind her, through the frost-fogged window, Bishop had not moved from his place at the gate. His eyes were still fixed on the empty road, his body settled into the frost like it belonged there. The office smelled like burnt coffee and toner. Sergeant Naylor turned out to be a stocky woman in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up into short gray hair, already sliding a stack of forms across the desk before Selene had finished sitting down. "Sign where the tabs are," Naylor said. "Initial the bottom of every third page. I know it looks like a lot. It's not, once you get going." Selene worked through the papers in silence, grateful for a task with a clear beginning and a clear end. Her signature, over and over, the same 6 letters that had started to feel less like her name and more like a shape her hand knew how to make. Widow's benefits, survivor documentation, closing accounts that had belonged, until 5 months ago, to a man who used to leave his boots by the door in a way that drove her crazy and that she now would have given almost anything to trip over again. "Last one," Naylor said, tapping a page. "This releases the base's liability on personal effects. You're not signing away anything, it's just paperwork wanting to be paperwork." Selene signed it without reading it, the way she'd signed the last dozen. "You get here okay, roads weren't too bad." Naylor asked, more out of habit than curiosity, gathering the papers into a folder. Fine, Selene said, though I nearly tripped over a dog at your gate. She said it lightly, meaning it as filler, the kind of small talk that fills the gap while someone stamps a form. Naylor's hands stopped moving. Tan and black? Gray around the muzzle, built like a shepherd? I guess. I didn't get a good look. He was just lying there, wouldn't move. Naylor took her glasses off slowly and set them on the desk, and Selene's stomach dropped. That's Bishop, she said. Retired working dog, used to be assigned to a different unit for detection work before he came back to Major Vale. Explosives detection, back when he still had the joints for it. She paused. He's been doing that every morning for about 5 months now, same spot. Same time, near enough you could set a watch by him. Doesn't matter if it's raining, doesn't matter if it's 40 below at the gate, he's there before the floodlights go off. Somebody trains him to do that? Selene asked, mostly to have something to say. That's the thing. Naylor reached under the desk and pulled out a battered green logbook, the kind of object that had clearly outlived several administrations, and set it in front of Selene without quite meeting her eyes. This is the duty log for the kennel. Every command, every scheduled walk, every handler assignment for every dog on this base goes in here. Go on, flip through the last 5 months. Selene didn't want to. Something in her already understood, in the way a body understands weather before a person names it, that she wasn't going to like what she found, or rather, what she wouldn't find. She flipped anyway, page after page of routine entries, feeding times, vet checks, training drills, all in the same careful block handwriting. Nowhere, not once, was there a line assigning Bishop to the eastern gate at dawn. There's nothing here, Selene said. No, ma'am. Because nobody told him to do it. Naylor took the book back and closed it, resting her hand flat on the cover as though holding something down. He decided that on his own. One morning about 5 months back, he just started showing up there instead of his kennel run, and he hasn't missed a day since. We tried moving his food bowl to see if that would break the habit. Didn't work. We tried keeping him in overnight. He scratched at the door until someone let him out. Eventually the CO said to just let him be, long as he wasn't a hazard. Selene felt something tighten low in her chest, her shoulders squaring on instinct before she'd even registered the threat. Dogs do things, she said too quickly. Habits. Maybe there used to be a feeding station there, or, I don't know, dogs are creatures of habit, that's all this is. Maybe, Naylor said, in the tone of someone who had already had this argument with herself many times and lost. That's what I thought too, first month or so. But there wasn't a feeding station there. There's nothing there. It's just the gate. 5 months. The number sat in the room between them, unspoken but suddenly enormous, because Selene didn't need a calendar to do that particular subtraction. 5 months back was almost exactly when the knock had come to her door, when 2 men in dress uniform had stood on her porch with their hats under their arms and told her, in the careful rehearsed language the Army trains people to use for exactly this purpose, that her husband would not be coming home. She told herself it was coincidence. Bases had dogs with strange habits all the time. Old animals got fixated on things, on schedules, on spots of ground that had once meant something and now meant nothing at all except the shape of an old routine worn into an aging brain. It didn't have to mean anything. It couldn't mean anything, because if it did, that meant something in this world still knew where Isaac had been standing that night, and Selene did not have the strength this morning, or possibly any morning, to sit with that thought. I should go, she said, standing so fast her chair scraped against the linoleum. I have the papers, that's what I came for. Thank you for your time, Sergeant. Naylor didn't try to stop her, only watched her with an expression that was somewhere between sympathy and worry, the look of someone who had said more than they meant to and now had to let the other person carry it alone. You take care driving back, Naylor said quietly to Selene's retreating back. And ma'am, for what it's worth, he's never once been aggressive. Whatever he's doing out there, it's not about keeping anyone away. Selene didn't answer. She pushed through the office door into the cold with the folder clutched against her chest, walking fast, not toward the gate where Bishop still lay in his frost-stiffened patch of grass, but toward the visitor lot, toward her car, toward the version of this morning where none of this had been said to her at all. The visitor lot was empty except for her own car and a maintenance truck parked crooked near the fence line. Selene crossed the gravel with her head down, the folder pressed so tight against her ribs that the edges of the papers had started to bend. She didn't look toward the gate. She had decided, somewhere between the office door and the parking lot, that she wasn't going to look toward the gate again, that she was going to get in her car and drive home and let this whole strange morning fold itself back into the ordinary shape of a Tuesday. Her hands were shaking when she got the door opened. She noticed that with a kind of distant surprise, the way you notice rain has started only after your shoulders are already wet. She sat down behind the wheel and pulled the door shut and just breathed for a moment, keys in her lap, engine off, the windshield fogging slightly at the edges from her own breath in the cold. 5 months, not one of them missed. She tried to think about something else. She thought about the drive home, about whether she needed gas, about the shift she was supposed to pick up on Thursday. None of it held. The number kept surfacing under everything else, like a stone under shallow water. And underneath the number was a question she had spent 5 months refusing to ask out loud. What had Isaac actually been doing that night at that gate? She had been told the facts, of course. Everyone had been told the facts, in that same rehearsed language. An incident during a scheduled perimeter check. Respond had been immediate. He had not suffered. She had nodded through all of it at the time, in the particular fog of the first week, unable to hold any single fact in her mind long enough to ask a follow-up question. Later, when the fog lifted enough for questions to form, there had been no one left in the room to ask them to. She put the key in the ignition and didn't turn it. Instead, without deciding to, she found herself remembering a phone call. Not the last one. She didn't let herself go near the last one, not on purpose, not in daylight, but an earlier one, 3 or 4 weeks before he died, a Sunday evening when he'd had guard duty and had called just to hear her voice for the 10 minutes he had free. She remembered the static on the line, the way his voice always sounded slightly compressed and far away when he called from post, like a radio tuned half a degree off station. He had been talking about the base, the way he always did when he was bored and cold and killing time until his relief showed up. Little observations, funny complaints, the kind of nothing talk that had felt, at the time, like the least important part of their marriage and that she would now have paid any price to get back. And somewhere in that nothing talk, he had mentioned a dog. She hadn't thought about it once in 5 months. It had been such a small thing, a single sentence in a 10-minute call about 100 small things, the kind of detail a mind simply doesn't keep unless something forces it back to the surface. But sitting in the cold car with the folder in her lap, she could hear it now almost exactly as he'd said it, in his voice, with that particular half-laugh he used when something amused him without being funny enough to actually laugh at. "There's this old dog that hangs around out here," he'd said. "Big shepherd mix, way too old to still be working, but nobody's got the heart to retire him all the way. He comes and sits with whoever's got the gate, doesn't do anything, just sits there like he's part of the post. I gave him half my sandwich last week, and now I think I'm stuck with him." She had laughed, she remembered that much, had said something about him bringing home strays even from a military base, and he had laughed too, and then his relief had shown up on the other end of the line, and he'd said he had to go, "Love you, talk tomorrow," and that had been that. One detail among 100, filed away and forgotten, the way a mind files away almost everything, keeping only what it thinks it will need again. She hadn't thought it would need this. Sitting in the car now, the pieces did not so much click into place as simply stop being separate. The old dog Isaac had mentioned in an offhand 10-minute call, months before he died. The dog at the gate this morning, who had looked at her like she was part of a post he was watching. The 5 months, the missing entry in the logbook, Sergeant Naylor's careful, worried face saying nobody told him to do it. It wasn't proof of anything, not in any way a courtroom would accept. It was one soldier's passing mention of a friendly stray, and a habit that had started around the same time he died, and a widow's desperate mind connecting two facts that might have nothing whatsoever to do with each other. She knew that. She told herself that, twice, out loud in the empty car, in the flat, reasonable voice she used at work when a patient's family needed calming down. It didn't help, because underneath the reasonable voice was something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with proof, and everything to do with the fact that for 5 months she had believed, with the low constant certainty of grief, that no part of that final night belonged to her, that she hadn't been there, hadn't heard his last words, hadn't been given so much as a scrap of what had actually happened to him in his final hours. And now, sitting in a cold car in a base parking lot, she had just been handed a scrap, a small, strange, impossible scrap, but a scrap all the same. A dog he had fed a sandwich to once, who now would not leave the place where he'd died. The first light of the sun cleared the tree line at the edge of the lot just then, cutting low and gold across the windshield, catching the fogged glass and turning the fog on the glass to a thin gold film. Selene sat very still inside that light, keys still untouched in the ignition, and felt something in her chest crack open that had been sealed shut since the two men in dress uniform had stood on her porch. She was not ready to call this proof, or to call it anything at all. But she was, she realized, no longer willing to drive away without knowing more. She got out of the car. The cold hit her face again, sharper now that the sun had started to climb, and she walked back across the gravel lot toward the base, faster than she had walked away from it, the folder of finished paperwork forgotten on the passenger seat behind her. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know who she was going to ask, or what she was going to say when she found them. She knew only that somewhere behind that gate was a dog who might impossibly know something about her husband's last night that she herself had never been told, and that she could not, this time, let herself walk away from that without trying. The guard at the gate looked up in mild surprise as she came back through, badge already in her hand from the last time. "Forget something, ma'am. I need to speak to someone about Bishop," she said, and was faintly startled to hear how steady her own voice sounded, saying the dog's name for the first time. "Major Vale. Sergeant Naylor said he used to be his handler." The guard studied her for a moment, then shrugged and reached for the phone on the wall of the guardhouse. "I'll see if he's on base today," he said. "You want to wait by the kennel yard. That's usually where he ends up this time of morning." Selene said that she would wait. She turned toward the kennel yard, and this time, when she passed the eastern gate, she didn't try to walk around Bishop at all. She stopped a few feet from him and simply looked, really looked, at the old dog lying in the frost, his eyes still fixed on some point past the gate that only he seemed able to see. And for the first time that morning, she let herself wonder, without flinching away from the thought, exactly what it was he was waiting for. Major Corbin Vale arrived at the kennel yard, walking with the slight forward lean of a man who had spent 30 years carrying more weight than his body currently needed to, even now that the weight was gone. He was in civilian clothes, a canvas jacket and work boots, and Selene understood before he said a word that he had come in on his own time, not because the base had summoned him. "You're Mrs. Quade," he said, not quite a question. "Selene," she said, "I'm sorry to pull you out here." Sergeant Naylor said, "You used to work with Bishop." Something moved across his face at the name, quick and unguarded, gone almost before she registered it. "I did, long time now. He was mine for 6 years before he went to detection work with a different unit, and mine again the last 3 since he retired." He looked past her, toward the gate, where Bishop still lay in the thinning frost, and his voice softened in a way that had nothing to do with performance. "Old habits die hard with him, always have." "Is that what this is?" Selene asked. "An old habit?" Vale didn't answer right away. He walked to the low fence at the edge of the kennel yard and rested his forearms on it, looking out at Bishop with an expression Selene couldn't quite name, his jaw working once before he spoke again. She followed him, standing a careful distance away, the folder of paperwork still sitting forgotten in her car. "Can I ask you something first?" Vale said, "before I answer that. Sergeant Naylor tell you why she called me. She said you might understand it better than she did." "That's generous of her." He gave a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Truth is, nobody understands it. I've had 3 years to watch that dog, and I still don't fully understand him. But I'll tell you what I know, and you can decide what to do with it. He was quiet for a moment, gathering something. Selene had the sense, watching him, of a man choosing carefully which door to open first. 3 years ago, when Bishop came off active detection work, I put in for him myself. Wasn't required. I was already retired from active handling by then, but I didn't like the idea of him going to some general kennel where nobody knew his history, so I kept him. He lived at my place for a while, then I got him a run here on base so he could still be around people, around dogs, the life he was used to. And for 3 years, Selene, that dog, had a routine like clockwork. Same walk in the morning, same nap spot in the afternoon, same corner of the run at night. He was steady, old but steady. And then something changed, Selene said, 5 months ago, almost to the week. Vale's jaw tightened slightly. One morning he wasn't in his usual spot when I came to walk him. Took me 20 minutes to find him, and when I did, he was out at the eastern gate, lying there like he'd always been there. I figured it was a fluke, brought him back, gave him breakfast, went about my day. Next morning, same thing. And the morning after that, he turned to look at her directly for the first time. In 3 years, Mrs. Quade, that dog never once broke his routine on his own. Not for weather, not for a change in his food, not even the time I moved him to a different run for 2 weeks during renovations. He adapts. He's an old soldier, he does what's asked of him, and he settles in wherever you put him. He does not, on his own, decide to change his entire morning for no reason. Until 5 months ago, when he did exactly that, and hasn't stopped since. Selene felt her chest tighten in the same way it had in the office with Naylor, that same reflex to reach for a reasonable explanation and hold it up like a shield. But something about the specificity of what Vale was describing, 20 minutes to find him, a routine unbroken across 3 full years, weather and renovation and nothing else that had ever moved him, made the shield feel thinner than it had an hour ago. "Do you know why that spot?" she asked. "Why the eastern gate specifically?" Vale was quiet again, longer this time. When he spoke, his voice had dropped, careful, the voice of a man choosing to say a true thing he'd rather not have to say. "That's the post where your husband was standing that night," he said. "I didn't put that together myself, not at first. It was one of the younger handlers who mentioned it to me a couple months back, almost in passing. Said, 'Isn't that funny? Bishop's spot is right about where they found Lieutenant Quade.' I didn't want to believe it meant anything. I still don't know that it does, but I checked the incident report against the exact location, and he wasn't wrong to notice it. Somewhere close to that gate, near enough to matter." Selene didn't say anything. She was looking past him now, out toward the gate, toward the small, graying, patient shape of the dog who had blocked her path that morning, without ever once looking directly at her face, only ever at the space behind her. "He never knew your husband," Vale went on, more gently now, as if he understood he was handling something fragile and had decided to keep going anyway, because stopping would be its own kind of cruelty. "Not the way you'd think. Bishop wasn't assigned to that unit, wasn't anyone's working partner out there. From what I understand, your husband used to feed him scraps before his shifts, same as half a dozen other guys did. That's the whole relationship, far as I know. A sandwich now and then. A dog getting fed by whoever's got gate duty that week." "He mentioned him," Selene said very quietly, "on the phone, once, weeks before. He said he'd given him half a sandwich, and now he thought he was stuck with him." Val looked at her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face seemed to settle, as if a small piece of a puzzle he'd been carrying for months had just slotted into place, not because it explained everything, but because it confirmed that what he was seeing wasn't only in his own head. "There you go then," he said quietly. "That's more relationship than I realized there was." He turned back toward the fence, both hands resting on the top rail, and for a while neither of them spoke. Out past them, Bishop shifted his weight slightly, resettling his hips against the cold ground without lifting his head, the small unconscious adjustment of a body that had been holding one position for a long time and intended to hold it a while longer. I had a dog once, Val said, after a while, in a voice that had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere older. Different war, different dog. Toward the end of his working life, he started doing things that didn't make sense to me, wouldn't settle at night. Kept pacing a particular fence line for no reason I could see. I told myself he was just getting old, going a little soft in the head, the way old dogs do. Didn't think much more of it than that. He paused. Found out afterward, long afterward, too long, that fence line was close to where we'd lost a man from his old unit, years before, in a different posting entirely. I never told anyone that, never had proof it meant what I thought it might mean, but I've had a long time to wonder whether I missed something that dog was trying to tell me, because I didn't want it to be true. He looked at her then, and his eyes were wet, though his voice stayed level, the discipline of a man who had learned a long time ago how to keep his composure while saying the hardest things he knew. I'm not going to tell you Bishop knows what he's doing, not the way a person knows things. I don't think dogs work that way, but I've watched that animal walk out to that exact spot every single morning for 5 months, in weather that would keep most men indoors, and lie down like he's got somewhere to be and nowhere else he'd rather be instead. He never did that for 3 years with me. He's doing it now. That's not nothing, Mrs. Quade. Whatever else it is or isn't, that's not nothing. Selene found that she was crying, quietly, without the effort or the shame that usually accompanied it in front of strangers. She didn't wipe her face. She stood at the fence beside a man she had met 20 minutes ago and let the tears run, watching the old dog at the gate hold his post in the strengthening morning light. Behind them, at the edge of the kennel yard, a military transport truck rolled slowly through the main gate and pulled to a stop near the administration building, its engine idling, waiting for someone to come tell it what it had come there to do. Neither of them noticed it yet. There would be time enough, in an hour or two, to understand exactly what that truck meant and how little time it had actually left them. The woman who climbed down from the transport truck moved like someone with exactly one task on her schedule and no interest in discussing it. She wore her uniform sharply pressed, a clipboard tucked under one arm, and she crossed the kennel yard with the brisk, even stride of a person who had learned long ago that hesitation only invited argument. "Major Vale," she said, by way of greeting, and then, with a brief, polite nod, "Ma'am." "Captain Crane," Vale said, straightening off the fence. Selene felt him go still beside her in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Didn't expect to see you out here. I called ahead. Front desk said you'd gone to the kennel yard." Crane flipped a page on her clipboard, businesslike, not unkind, simply efficient in the way of someone who had a great deal of ground to cover before lunch. "This concerns Bishop's file. I wanted to deliver it to you directly, rather than through channels, given his history with your unit." "Deliver what?" Vale's voice had gone careful. "The Eastern Kennel Block is being decommissioned as part of the base consolidation, effective this quarter. Every animal currently housed there needs to be reassigned to Fort Halloway or released to a certified civilian handler within the transfer window. Bishop's on the list." Crane held out a single sheet from the clipboard. "Transport scheduled for 0600, day after tomorrow. 48 hours from now." Selene felt the number land in her chest like something physical, a fist closing around her ribs. 2 days, she said, before she could stop herself. "You're moving him in 2 days." Crane looked at her for the first time, taking her in. The paperwork folder was back in the car, but grief has a way of announcing itself without documentation, and something in Crane's face flickered, briefly, with the recognition of who she must be. It didn't change her posture. "I understand this is difficult timing," Crane said, and her voice, to her credit, was not unkind. "But the consolidation order came down from command 3 weeks ago. Every kennel on this base has a transfer date. Bishop's isn't special in that regard. I'm not able to make exceptions for individual animals, even ones with history." "He's not just any animal," Vale said, and Selene heard, under the level military calm of his voice, something close to pleading. "Odalus, you know his file, you know what he did in 3 deployments. Surely there's a review process, a delay request, something." "There is," Crane said. "I filed one myself, actually, 2 weeks ago, when I first saw his name on the consolidation list. It was denied." The board's position is that Bishop is retired, non-operational, and the Eastern Bloc needs to close on schedule to make room for the incoming K-9 unit from Fort Holloway. I'm sorry, Major. I know what he means to you, but I don't have the authority to override a command decision on sentiment. Selene flinched at the word, sentiment, the way Crane said it like a door closing gently and firmly at the same time. There has to be something, Selene said. She was surprised at the steadiness in her own voice, given how unsteady she felt everywhere else. An adoption process, I don't know, a civilian sponsor, anything. He's not just an animal being reassigned, Captain. He's been doing something out at that gate every single morning for 5 months, and I think it might have to do with my husband. Crane's expression didn't soften exactly, but it slowed, the brisk efficiency giving way, briefly, to something more careful. I've heard about the gate thing, she said. Everyone on base has, at this point. I'm not dismissing it, ma'am. I've watched him out there myself a few mornings, on my way in early. It's an unusual thing to see. She paused, and for a moment Selene thought she might be about to bend. Then Crane's shoulders squared again, the discipline reasserting itself. But I can't hold a transfer schedule for an unusual thing, Major. I wish I could tell you different. There's a civilian adoption process technically, but it takes a minimum of 2 weeks to process even on an expedited basis. Background check, home inspection, veterinary clearance. 2 weeks, not 2 days. Then extend the transfer, Vale said. I don't have the authority to extend it. I told you, I already tried. Crane's voice had an edge to it now, not anger, but the particular fatigue of someone repeating a truth she wished were not the truth. I'm not the villain in this, Major, whatever you might be thinking right now. 3 years ago, I sat on a different desk and I held a decommission order for 6 weeks past its deadline because I felt sorry for the family involved. It cost the base thousands of dollars in delayed funding, and it cost me a formal reprimand in my file. I promised myself after that I would never again let how I felt about a situation change what the paperwork required. I'm sorry that promise happens to land on you today, but it's the only way I know how to do this job without it eating me alive. There was a silence after that, longer than any of the ones before it, filled only by the distant clank of a kennel gate somewhere out of sight and the low idle of the truck still waiting near the administration building. Crane looked between the two of them, then down at her clipboard, and something in her posture suggested this conversation was, as far as she was concerned, already over. I have 3 more kennel blocks to process today, she said, more quietly than before. I really am sorry, ma'am. For your loss, and for the timing of all this. If there's a way to move faster on the adoption paperwork, I'll flag it as a priority on my end. That's the most I can offer. She gave a short nod, tucked the clipboard back under her arm, and walked back toward the truck without waiting for a response, her boots crunching evenly across the gravel, the sound of someone who had learned to keep walking through difficult conversations because stopping never made them easier. Selene watched her go, and then turned to look at Bishop, still lying at the eastern gate in the strengthening morning light, utterly unaware that a clock had just started counting down somewhere above his head. 48 hours, she said, mostly to herself. Vale ran a hand over his face, the fight visibly draining out of him and something colder taking its place. I'll call some people, he said. Old contacts, people who still owe me favors from 30 years in. It might not do anything. Command doesn't reverse consolidation orders for sentiment. She's right about that much. He looked at Selene, and something in his expression had shifted, become more urgent, more direct than it had been a moment before. But you might be able to do something I can't. What's that? You're his widow, not Bishop's, I mean your husband's. That carries weight with this command, in a way rank doesn't always. If you filed for adoption yourself, today, right now, put your name on it, made it clear this isn't sentiment, this is a widow asking to keep something that connects her to her husband's last night, that's a different conversation than a retired major making noise about an old dog. I've seen exceptions made for less. Selene looked past him, toward the corner of the yard where a coil of chain-link leash sat looped over a hook by the kennel door, unused, waiting for whichever animal needed transporting first. She hadn't noticed it until just now. She found she couldn't stop looking at it. 2 days. She had walked onto this base 4 hours ago, wanting nothing more than to sign her name on a form and disappear before anyone could ask how she was holding up. Now she was standing at a fence, being told that if she wanted to keep the one living thing on this earth that seemed to still remember something true about her husband's final night, she had less time to prove it mattered than most people spend deciding what to have for dinner. "Where do I file?" she said. "Right now. Where do I go?" Vile looked at her for a long moment, something like relief and something like grief moving across his face at the same time, and then he pointed toward the administration building, past the idling truck, past Captain Crane's retreating figure. "Follow me," he said. "We start now." The adoption paperwork sat half-filled on the desk. In the small break room Vale kept off the side of the kennel office, a space that smelled of instant coffee and old cedar shavings. Selene had gotten through the first 2 pages easily enough. Name, address, relationship to the deceased service member, reason for request. It was the 3rd page that had stopped her, a single line asking her to describe, in her own words, her connection to the animal in question. She had been staring at that blank line for almost 10 minutes. Vale had gone quiet across the small table, giving her the space, not pushing. He wasn't filling out forms of his own. There was nothing left for him to do on paper, only to sit with her while she found whatever words the line was asking for. Outside the window, faint and gray, the kennel yard held its ordinary noise, a dog barking twice somewhere, a hose running. "I don't know what to write," Selene said finally, setting the pen down. "I don't know what my connection to him is. I met him this morning. I don't even know if what I think happened is real, or if I've just built a story out of a sandwich and a coincidence because I need it to be true." Vale didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice was gentle in a way that gave her room, rather than closing it. "What do you think stops you from writing it down?" She almost deflected the question, the way she deflected everything now, with a joke or a change of subject, or simply silence long enough that the other person let it go. But something about the last 4 hours, about the cold morning and the dog at the gate and the man across from her who had already told her something he'd never told anyone else about a dog and a fence line, made deflection feel suddenly impossible, or at least pointless. "There's something I've never told anyone," she said. "Not my sister, not my mother, not the grief counselor they made me see twice before I stopped going. I don't even know if I can tell you. I don't know why I think I can tell you." "You don't have to," Vale said. "But if it helps to say it out loud to someone who isn't going to try and fix it, I'm not going anywhere." Selene looked down at her hands. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped, flattened, like something rehearsed alone in the dark many times but never once said aloud. "The last time Isaac called me, I was at work. Middle of a shift, understaffed like always. My phone buzzed and I saw his name, and I remember thinking, I'll call him back on my break, it's fine, he calls most nights, this isn't different. And then a patient's monitor started alarming and I put the phone in my pocket and went to deal with it, and by the time I got a free minute, 25 minutes later, there was a voicemail instead of a missed call." She stopped. Vale waited, still, patient, the way she imagined he must once have waited for a dog to work a scent out at its own pace, without rushing it, without letting his own urgency bleed into the animal's concentration. "It was 40 seconds long," Selene said, the voicemail. "I know because I've listened to the length 100 times without playing it, just staring at the number on the screen. 40 seconds, and the call dropped. Or he lost signal, I don't know which, but the message just cuts off, mid-sentence. He's saying something about the weather, something small, and then there's this crackle, and it just ends. I don't know what he was going to say next. I never got to call him back that night, because by the time I finished my shift it was late, and I told myself I'd catch him in the morning." Her voice cracked, finally, on the last word. There was no morning. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, the dog that had been barking earlier had gone silent too. "I have played that 40 seconds so many times I could probably recite it word for word," she went on, quieter now, the flat rehearsed tone breaking apart into something rawer. "And every single time, all I can think is, I was 20 feet away from my phone doing my job, being useful to a stranger, and my husband needed 10 more seconds of me, and I wasn't there for them. I keep thinking if I'd just answered, if I'd just stepped out of that room 30 seconds sooner, maybe I'd have heard whatever he was about to say, and maybe that would be enough to hold on to, and instead I have 40 seconds of him talking about the weather, and then nothing. And some part of me has decided that because I wasn't there for that call, I don't get to stand at his memorial and cry like the wives who were there. I don't get to grieve the way they grieve. I forfeited that, somehow, in my own head, the second I let that call go to voicemail. She looked up at Vale, and her eyes were wet, unguarded now, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be with anyone in 5 months. That's why I don't go to things. That's why I sign forms and leave before anyone can ask how I'm doing. Because I'm afraid if I let anyone see how much this is destroying me, someone's going to ask where I was that night, and I'm going to have to tell them the truth, which is that I was 20 feet from my phone, and I let it ring. Vale was quiet for a long moment. He didn't reach for platitudes, didn't tell her it wasn't her fault in the easy, automatic way people sometimes do, the way that can feel more like a door closing than a door opening. He simply looked at her, steadily, the way a man looks at something he intends to take seriously. "Selene," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the honorific. "You didn't cause that call to drop. You didn't choose to be at work that night, any more than he chose to be standing at a gate that needed watching. That's not a coincidence of neglect. That's just what it means to love someone whose life doesn't stop needing them to be somewhere else." He paused, letting that settle. "You keep talking about what you weren't there for. You weren't there for the last 40 seconds of a phone call, but you were there for years of mornings before that. You were there for every ordinary day that never made it into a story because nothing dramatic happened in it. That counts. It has to count for something, or none of it means anything, and I don't believe that, and I don't think you do either, not really." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping, careful and certain in a way that made it land differently than anything anyone had said to her in 5 months. "You don't need to have been present for those 40 seconds to be allowed to stand here now, grieving him with your whole chest, in front of anyone who's watching. You didn't forfeit anything. You don't need to earn the right to miss your husband. Nobody does." Selene put both hands over her face and cried, finally, without holding anything back, the sound raw and unguarded in the small room, and Vale didn't try to stop her or hurry her through it. He simply stood, quietly, filled the kettle on the counter, and set a cup of tea in front of her a few minutes later, without a word, the steam curling up between them, while she found her way back to a steady breath. It was in that stillness, minutes later, cup untouched, that they both heard it at the same time through the window. A low, restless sound from the kennel yard outside, a scrape of claws on gravel, unfamiliar and urgent in a way that made Vale's head come up sharply. Bishop, who had not moved from his post in 5 months of mornings, was on his feet. By the time they got outside, Bishop was already moving, and it took Selene a moment to understand what she was seeing, because for 5 months, according to everyone who had watched him, he had done exactly one thing at the eastern gate: lie down and stay. He had never paced. He had never left his spot before the hour he judged the post relieved. But now he was crossing the kennel yard with a purposeful, uneven gait, the stiffness of an old body moving faster than it wanted to, nose low, ears forward, heading not toward them but past them, toward the far side of the yard. "Bishop," Vale called, more out of instinct than expectation, and the dog didn't so much as flick an ear back at him. He kept moving, and after a few steps he stopped, turned his head, and looked directly at Selene, the first time all morning he had looked at her face, rather than through her toward whatever he was watching for. Then he turned and kept walking. "He wants us to follow," Selene said, and heard how strange the sentence sounded even as she said it, and didn't care. They followed. Bishop led them out of the kennel yard, along the low fence line, past the administration building where the transport truck still idled, empty now, its driver somewhere inside filling out forms of his own. He moved with a strange, deliberate certainty, not the loose, sniffing wander of a dog following a scent, but something closer to a soldier retracing a familiar patrol route, choosing each turn without hesitation, as if the path had been worn into him as thoroughly as the path from bed to gate that had defined his last 5 months. He led them past the eastern gate itself, the spot Selene had stepped around that morning, the spot he had held every dawn for 5 months, and beyond it, toward a low rise at the edge of the base perimeter that she hadn't noticed before, a small watchpost half-shadowed by a stand of bare winter trees, close enough to the fence line that it must have had a clear line of sight down the access road in both directions. "This is it," Vale said quietly, coming to a stop a few feet behind the dog. His voice had gone rough. "This is where the incident report puts him. This is exactly where your husband was standing." Bishop walked the last few steps alone, unhurried now, and lay down in the exact center of the small clearing, in a patch of ground still faintly damp from melted frost, his body settling into the earth with the particular ease of something returning to a place it knew by feel rather than by sight. He rested his head on his paws and looked out down the access road, the same posture Selene had seen at the gate that morning. Except that here, for the first time, something in the set of his shoulders looked less like waiting and more like arrival. Selene stood very still, looking at him, and then, slowly, she walked forward and knelt down in the cold, damp grass beside him. She didn't say anything at first. She simply reached out and rested her hand flat against the ground, in the small space between Bishop's front paws, the exact patch of earth where, if the report was right, if the strange, quiet certainty of a dog who had never once broken routine in 3 years was to be trusted, her husband had been standing in the last moments before everything in her life had changed. The ground was cold under her palm, ordinary, unremarkable, no different from any other patch of grass on the base, and somehow it was the most significant thing she had touched in 5 months. The morning sun had climbed high enough now to reach the clearing directly, cutting low and warm through the bare branches overhead, and where it fell across her hand and the damp earth beneath it, she thought, she would never be entirely sure, afterward, whether she had imagined it or truly felt it, that the ground held a trace of warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. "I'm here," she said, so quietly that even Vale, standing a respectful distance away, barely caught the words. "I know I wasn't, that night, but I'm here now." Bishop lifted his head and looked at her. Not at the gate this time, not at some fixed point down the road that only he could see. He looked directly at her, into her face, with an attention that felt entirely different from anything he had shown her that morning. It looked absurdly, impossibly, almost like recognition, though Vale would have told her, and later did tell her, that dogs don't recognize people they've never met. Whatever it was, it settled something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the 2 men in dress uniform had stood on her porch 5 months ago. She put her hand on the side of his neck, gently, and he leaned his head into her palm, just slightly, the smallest possible gesture, and let out a long breath through his nose that seemed to carry more weight than a sound that size should have been able to carry. Behind them, Vale had gone very still, one hand pressed briefly over his mouth, watching the two of them with an expression that belonged to a man finally seeing something he had spent months circling without daring to name. "I don't think he was waiting for you specifically," Vale said quietly, after a while, more to himself than to her, working something out as he spoke. "I don't think it worked that way. I think he was waiting for the post to be relieved. Some duty that never got closed out, some shift that never got handed off, and every morning he came out here because as far as he understood it, nobody had come to take over yet." He paused, and his voice caught slightly. "I think you're the relief, Selene. I think you're the one who finally showed up to take the watch." Selene didn't answer, not in words. She stayed kneeling in the damp grass with her hand on Bishop's neck and her palm still pressed to the cold earth where her husband had once stood, and let herself feel, for the first time in 5 months, something that wasn't only grief. It was grief, still. Underneath everything, it would likely always be grief, underneath everything, for the rest of her life, but layered now with something else, something that felt almost like relief itself, the particular loosening of setting a weight down after carrying it alone too long. The central question that had followed her since the moment she stepped around this dog at the gate that morning: why would an animal with no bond to her husband, no working history with him, nothing beyond a shared sandwich and a handful of quiet mornings, take up a post that belonged, by every reasonable measure, to someone else entirely, did not resolve itself into a tidy answer, not the kind a courtroom or a science journal would accept. But kneeling there in the cold, damp clearing, with the sun climbing over the bare trees and Bishop's steady weight leaning into her hand, she understood, in the only way that mattered to her, exactly why. Some duties don't require a bond to become sacred. Some watches get kept simply because someone was there when it started, and something in them recognized that a shift had been left open, unfinished, uncovered, and decided, without needing to be asked, without needing any promise of thanks, to hold that ground until somebody came who could finally take it from them. She had spent 5 months believing she had no right to grieve because she hadn't been present for the ending. Kneeling in this small clearing, hand on a dog who had held a post through 152 mornings on behalf of a man he barely knew, she understood, finally and completely, that presence was never the price of the right to love someone. It had never been required. It had never been the thing keeping this vigil going at all. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, an engine turned over, the transport truck at the administration building, its driver returning, its schedule unmoved by anything that had just happened in this quiet clearing at the edge of the base. 48 hours had begun ticking down the moment Captain Crane had handed Vale that single sheet of paper, and nothing about this morning, however extraordinary, had stopped the clock. But something had changed all the same, and both Selene and Vale understood it in the same instant, watching Bishop settle more fully into the ground beside her, his eyes half closed now, his breathing slow and even for the first time in 5 months of vigilant mornings. Whatever happened next, with paperwork and transport orders and a captain who believed absolutely in following the rules, whatever the base decided about where Bishop would sleep 2 nights from now, the thing he had been waiting 5 months to accomplish had already happened. He had found his relief. He had finally been able to lie down here not as a sentry holding an unclosed post, but simply as an old dog resting in the sun beside the one person he had come, at last, to let himself need. Captain Crane was still at her clipboard when they found her, standing near the transport truck reviewing the next block's paperwork, and she looked up with the faint, practiced weariness of someone expecting another difficult conversation before she'd even heard what it was about. "Captain," Selene said, before Vale could speak for her, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually look at what I'm about to show you before you answer." Crane's eyebrows rose slightly, but she lowered the clipboard. "Go ahead." Selene didn't explain in words, not at first. She simply turned and pointed back toward the small clearing at the edge of the base, where Bishop still lay in the thinning morning light, exactly where he had settled, unmoving, at rest in a way none of them had ever seen him rest before. Vale, beside her, said quietly, "That's where Lieutenant Quade died, Captain. Bishop just walked us out there himself. Nobody led him, he led us." Crane looked toward the clearing for a long moment, her expression unreadable, the clipboard hanging loosely at her side. Then, without a word, she walked toward it, and Selene and Vale followed a few steps behind, giving her the space to see it on her own terms. She stopped a short distance from Bishop and simply watched him, the way you'd watch something you were trying, honestly, to understand rather than simply process. He lifted his head briefly at her approach, considered her without alarm, and set it back down, entirely unbothered, entirely at peace, in a way that stood in stark contrast to every account Crane had heard of him that morning. "I've read his file 3 times since this consolidation order came down," Crane said quietly, almost to herself. "Decorated service record, no behavioral flags in 10 years, and then 5 months of this." She crouched down, slowly, and reached out one hand, not quite touching him yet, asking permission the way people who genuinely respect animals learn to ask. Bishop leaned his head very slightly toward her palm, and she rested her hand against the side of his neck, gentle, uncertain, and something in her posture shifted, her voice slowing, her hand staying a beat too long against his neck. "I've never once been late filing a decommission order," she said, still crouched beside him, not looking at either of them now. "Not in 6 years in this role. I built my whole career on that. 6 years ago I let sentiment cost me a reprimand and I swore it would never happen again." She was quiet for a moment, her hand still resting on Bishop's neck. "I don't actually think this is sentiment though. I think I've been telling myself that word to avoid looking directly at what I'm actually seeing." She stood, brushing off her knees, and looked at Selene directly. "I can't extend the transfer window. That decision is above my authority, and appealing it again would take longer than the 48 hours we have." She paused. "But I can process an emergency adoption today, on my own authority, if Major Vale is willing to co-sign as a character reference and cover the veterinary clearance himself. It's irregular. It skips 2 weeks of standard processing. I have never once approved an irregular adoption in 6 years of doing this job." "Will you?" Selene asked. Crane looked back at Bishop, resting easily now in the sun, and something in her face settled, quiet and certain. "I'll have the paperwork ready within the hour," she said. "You'll need to sign for full civilian custody, effective immediately, so he doesn't need to board that truck at all. I'll log it as a compassionate exception under command discretion. It's the first one of those I've ever written." A faint, unexpected smile crossed her face. "It won't be the last, I don't think. Not after this." The paperwork, when it came, took less time than any of the forms Selene had signed that morning, though it felt, somehow, immeasurably heavier in her hand. 6-year-old habits she was watching a stranger set aside without ceremony, for a reason that couldn't be measured in regulations. Vale signed his section without hesitation, his hand steadier than it had been at any point that day. Crane signed last, and when she did, she knelt one more time and rested her palm briefly on Bishop's head before standing back up, a small, private gesture that had nothing to do with any procedure written into any manual. By the time the transport truck pulled back out through the main gate an hour later, its cargo hold carrying 3 other dogs bound for reassignment, Bishop was not among them. He sat instead at the edge of the kennel yard beside Selene, unleashed for the first time all morning, watching the truck roll away down the access road with the same steady, patient attention he had once given the eastern gate every dawn for 5 months, except now, when the truck disappeared around the bend, his attention didn't stay fixed on the empty road. It turned, instead, toward Selene and stayed there. "First time in 6 years I've broken protocol," Crane said, standing nearby, watching the two of them with an expression closer to relief than regret. "Feels different than I expected. I thought it would feel like failure. It doesn't." Vale, beside her, said nothing at all, only watched Selene kneel down one more time to rest her forehead briefly against the top of Bishop's head, the old dog leaning his full weight into her, without hesitation, as if some final piece of him had finally been allowed to stop holding so carefully still. The next morning, the floodlights at the eastern gate switched off right on schedule, same as every morning before it. But for the first time in 153 mornings, Bishop was not lying alone in the frost, waiting for a relief that never came in a form he could name. He was at the small clearing by the perimeter fence, curled beside Selene, on an old blanket she had brought from home, both of them watching the sun climb slow and gold over the bare winter trees. She wasn't there to sign anything, wasn't there to finish anything, wasn't rushing toward her car with her head down. She was simply there, the way a person is there for someone they've chosen to stay near. She reached down and rested her hand on his neck, and he leaned into it without lifting his head, utterly at ease, no post left to hold, no watch left unclosed. Selene smiled, quietly, for the first time since the 2 men in dress uniform had stood on her porch. Somewhere else, in places no one would ever film or write down, other quiet watches were still being kept, small, unspoken loyalties standing guard over spaces the rest of the world had already stopped noticing. Some of them were still waiting. Bishop's watch, at least, was over.